Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Just a heads up, there are a few ads between the 5 and 15-minute mark, then it's completely ad-free after that. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax or drift off to sleep. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. In 1978, Mary Vincent was just a teenager, trying to get from one place to another. She was hitchhiking through Central California, doing what a lot of young people did at the time, especially those who didn't have much money and believed, or wanted to believe, that the world was mostly safe. It was a different era. People trusted strangers more than they should have, and the danger of getting into a car with someone you didn't know wasn't talked about the way it is now. Mary was picked up by a man named Lawrence Singleton. At first, there was nothing about him that immediately screamed danger. He seemed normal enough, just another person driving along a long stretch of road. For a while, everything appeared fine. Then, at some point during the drive, he pulled over saying he needed to stop and relieve himself. Mary got out of the van as well, likely without thinking much of it. That decision, that ordinary moment, changed her life forever. Without warning, Singleton attacked her. He hit her over the head, stunning her, and then restrained her. She was tied up and forced into the back of his van. From that moment on, Mary was completely at his mercy. What followed was a prolonged nightmare. He repeatedly raped her, holding her captive, fully in control, while she had no way to escape and no way to fight back in any meaningful way. Eventually, when he decided he was finished with her, he did something almost impossible to comprehend. He took a hatchet and chopped off both of her arms below the elbows. This was not a quick act. It was deliberate, brutal, and meant to ensure she would not survive. After mutilating her, he stripped her naked and threw her over the side of a steep embankment along a poorly traveled highway. He left her there to bleed to death, assuming that no one would ever find her in time. Mary was alone, naked, severely injured, and losing blood fast. Most people would have gone into shock and died where they landed, but Mary refused to give up. She was in unimaginable pain, but her will to live was stronger than what had been done to her. She realized that the bleeding from her severed arms would kill her quickly if she didn't do something. Using what strength she had left, she buried the ends of her arms into the dirt, packing soil around the wounds in an attempt to slow the blood loss. It was a desperate, instinctive act, but it worked enough to keep her alive a little longer. Then she did something even more unbelievable. She began climbing. The embankment she had been thrown down was about 30 feet high. It was steep, uneven, and covered with loose dirt and brush. Mary had no arms. She was weak, injured, and in shock. Still, inch by inch, she climbed. She used her legs, her torso, and whatever leverage she could manage. Every movement would have sent waves of pain through her body, but she kept going. She later said that she was fueled by pure survival instinct. She was not ready to die. Eventually, she reached the road. The first car that came along saw her. A young woman, naked, covered in blood, with no arms, standing on the side of a remote highway. Instead of stopping, the driver sped away. Fear took over and they chose to escape rather than help. That moment is hard to think about, because it's impossible not to wonder what that driver felt later once the news broke and the truth came out. Not long after, a second car appeared. Inside was a honeymooning couple who had taken a wrong turn and ended up on that stretch of road by accident. When they saw Mary, they stopped. They didn't hesitate. They wrapped her up. did what they could to keep her warm and calm, and rushed her to the nearest town with a hospital. Mary survived. Against every odd, against every expectation, she lived. She was able to give a description of her attacker. She identified Lawrence Singleton and later testified against him in court. Her testimony was powerful and horrifying, detailing what he had done to her and how close she came to dying. For many people, her survival alone felt miraculous. But what came next was almost as shocking as the crime itself. Singleton was convicted, but the sentence he received was appallingly short. He was given just 14 years in prison. Of those 14 years, he served only 8 before being released early for what was described as good behavior. The idea that a man who had tortured, raped, and mutilated a teenage girl could be considered well-behaved behind bars was deeply disturbing to the public. Mary Vincent's case became a turning point. The outrage over Singleton's early release led to changes in the law, particularly around crimes involving torture and extreme violence. New laws were created to prevent people who committed such acts from being released early. But for Mary, those changes came too late to protect her from the knowledge that the man who had tried to kill her was free. When Singleton was released, communities refused to accept him. Town after town made it clear they did not want him living among them. Parents protested, neighbors objected. No one wanted to be the place that allowed a known predator to settle nearby. Because of this, he ended up serving out the remainder of his parole, living on the grounds of San Quentin prison itself, simply because there was nowhere else willing to take him. Eventually, after his parole ended, Singleton moved to Florida, where he had family. Despite everything he had done, he was free to start over, free to live, to move, to interact with others. It's a reality that feels deeply unfair, especially when compared to what Mary had lost. In Florida, Singleton became involved with a sex worker named Roxanne Hayes. The pattern repeated. He murdered her, proving that what he had done to Mary was not an isolated act, but part of who he was. This time, the system did not fail in the same way. Mary Vincent testified again, recounting her own attack and making sure the court understood exactly what kind of man Singleton was. Her voice, once again, played a critical role in ensuring that he would not receive leniency. Singleton was sentenced to death. He never made it to execution. In 2001, he died of cancer while on death row. Many people, including Mary herself, expressed no sympathy for his suffering. After what he had inflicted on others, few felt that his death was unjust. Mary Vincent, meanwhile, continued living. She moved to Washington State. She built a life in the aftermath of unimaginable trauma. She had 2 sons, raised them, and became an artist. Her artwork often reflects pain, survival, and strength, shaped by everything she endured. She did not let what was done to her define her entirely, though it undoubtedly shaped her in ways no one should ever have to experience. Mary is often described as a survivor, and she is. But that word doesn't fully capture what she has had to live with. Survival didn't end the night she made it to the road. It continued through years of recovery, physical pain, emotional trauma, public attention, courtrooms, and the knowledge that her attacker was once again walking free. It's hard to understand how someone carries that weight and still moves forward, how someone rebuilds a sense of safety after having it so violently destroyed, how someone trusts the world again after the world proves how cruel it can be. Mary Vincent's story is not just about brutality, it's about endurance, about the human will to live when everything is stacked against you, about a teenage girl who refused to die when a man tried to erase her, about a woman who stood up in court not once but twice and made sure her voice mattered. Her story is horrifying, but it is also deeply human. It reminds us that survival is not passive. Sometimes it means crawling, bleeding, terrified, toward a road you hope someone will travel. Sometimes it means speaking the truth over and over, even when it hurts, so that others are protected. Mary Vincent lived, and in doing so, she changed laws, exposed failures in the justice system, and showed a level of strength that is almost impossible to imagine. Even now, decades later, her story leaves people shaken, angry, and in awe of her resilience. I honestly don't know how she does it either, but the fact that she does, that she continues to live, create, and exist in the world, is a powerful reminder that even in the face of the worst evil, some people refuse to be broken. When people talk about small towns, they usually talk about safety, about knowing your neighbors, about quiet nights and familiar faces. They talk like danger only lives in cities, like violence needs anonymity to exist. I grew up hearing that story over and over. I believed it too for a long time. But this is the moment that belief died for good. 2 people I went to school with were murdered in their own home. Not strangers, not names on the news that meant nothing to me. People I had shared hallways with. One of them was someone I'd been friendly with years earlier. Not a best friend, but someone I knew well enough to joke with, to recognize instantly, to remember clearly. He and his girlfriend were young, 19 and 21, barely out of high school, barely even started with life. When people hear stories like this, they often assume time passed first, that adulthood happened, that things drifted far away from the structure of school before something this bad could occur. But that's not what happened here. It was less than a year and a half after I graduated. Some of us were still figuring out college schedules. Some were working their first real jobs. Some were still living at home. Life hadn't spread us far yet. And then suddenly, 2 people were gone. The way it happened is what still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. It wasn't a moment of panic or impulse. It was deliberate, cold, cruel in a way that doesn't come from anger alone, but from complete disregard for human life. They were asleep when it started. Someone broke into their home in the middle of the night. They were woken up, forced to sit down, made fully aware of what was happening. There was time for fear, time for confusion, time for that horrible realization that something is very wrong and that you can't undo the moment you're in. Then they were shot and killed. All of it was over an ounce of weed. Not pounds, not trafficking, not some elaborate criminal operation. An ounce. Something people argue over every day. Something people have been killed for far too many times to count, but still feels impossible to justify when you say it out loud. The people who did it were exactly the kind of figures everyone tells you to avoid, but never believes will show up in your own life. One was a methed-out tweaker, the other a gang-affiliated friend. People who lived on the edges of things, fueled by paranoia, entitlement, and violence. People who saw others not as human beings, but as obstacles or opportunities. They didn't know the victims the way I did. They didn't see classmates or kids who had just graduated or people with families who loved them. They saw targets. They saw something they wanted. And they were willing to destroy 2 lives to take it. What gets me isn't just the brutality, it's how close it all felt. These weren't people from a neighboring state or a distant city. This was my town. Streets I knew, houses I'd driven past, places I'd been near without thinking twice. When the news broke, it didn't feel real at first. It felt like a rumor, the kind that gets exaggerated as it spreads. People whispered, texts flew around, social media filled with fragments of information, none of it complete, all of it terrifying. Then the confirmation came. Names, ages, details. I remember sitting there, staring at my phone, rereading the same sentences over and over like maybe they would change. like maybe I had misunderstood, like maybe this was someone else with the same name. But it wasn't, it was them. The realization hits in waves. First shock, then disbelief, then this deep, hollow feeling in your chest when you understand that no amount of wishing or logic will undo what already happened. What haunts me most is imagining those final moments, being woken up in the dark, trying to orient yourself, seeing strangers in your home, hearing demands that don't make sense yet, thinking maybe if you comply, maybe if you stay calm, maybe if you do everything right, this will end with them leaving, then realizing it won't. And people love to say things like, they were in the wrong crowd, or they shouldn't have been involved with that stuff, because it gives them distance. It creates the illusion that tragedy only happens to people who deserve it, or who made obvious mistakes. But that's a lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep better at night. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. They were young people living their lives. They didn't expect death to come through their door while they slept. None of us do. What followed was just as ugly in a different way. The town went quiet, but not in a peaceful sense. In a tense, watchful way. Parents hugged their kids tighter. People locked their doors earlier. Everyone started looking at everyone else a little differently. At the same time, the gossip machine went into overdrive. Everyone suddenly had an opinion. Everyone suddenly knew what really happened. Rumors about drugs, money, who knew who owed what. The victims slowly stopped being people and started becoming a story others felt entitled to dissect. That part made me angry, because no matter what anyone thinks they know, 2 young lives were taken violently and senselessly. They didn't get to grow older. They didn't get second chances. They didn't get the luxury of learning from mistakes. Everything they were and could have been ended in one night, because someone else decided their lives were disposable. I think about how recently we had all been in the same schools, walking the same halls, complaining about the same teachers, stressing over exams and jobs and relationships. None of us were thinking about funerals yet. Death still felt like something that belonged to older people, to accidents on the news, to distant tragedies. This ripped that illusion apart. It also exposed something people don't like to admit about small towns. They don't protect you from violence. They just hide it better. Problems don't disappear just because the population is smaller. Drugs still circulate, desperation still exists, anger still festers. And when things go wrong, there are fewer places to run and fewer people to disappear among. In some ways, that makes it worse, because everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows the victims. Everyone knows someone connected to the people who did it. The ripples spread fast and deep. There's no anonymity to dull the impact. I remember driving through town afterward and feeling like everything looked the same. But nothing felt the same. Same buildings, same roads, same quiet nights. But now all of it felt fragile, like the surface of things was thin and easily broken. What stays with me most is the age, 19, 21. Those are ages where you still feel invincible, or at least distant from death, where the future feels wide open, even if you don't know what you want yet. They were robbed not just of life, but of possibility, and all of it over something so small it feels obscene to even compare it to the cost. An ounce of weed. When people romanticize crime or talk about violence like it's dramatic or exciting, I think about this. About 2 kids being forced awake in their own home. About fear in the dark. About gunshots where there should have been nothing but sleep. About parents getting phone calls no one should ever have to receive. I think about how quickly things can fall apart. How one bad decision by one violent person can erase entire futures. How proximity doesn't equal safety. How familiarity doesn't equal protection. And I think about how people still insist that small towns are different, that they're safer, that things like this don't happen here. They do. They absolutely do. They just feel worse when they do because you can't distance yourself from them. You can't pretend they belong to someone else's world. They happened in your streets, to people you recognized, in houses that looked just like everyone else's. This story changed how I see everything. It changed how I think about trust, about randomness, about how close violence always is, even when life feels calm. It stripped away the last bit of innocence I had left about where danger lives. Small-town America isn't immune to horror. It isn't insulated from cruelty. Sometimes it's the perfect place for it to hide, because no one wants to believe it could happen there. 2 people I knew died because someone decided their lives were worth less than whatever they wanted to take from them. That's not a statistic, that's not a headline. That's a truth I carry with me. And anyone who tells you that small towns are safer by default hasn't lived long enough or close enough to see how wrong that belief can be. When my dad was a kid, around 10 years old, his world was very different from mine, but in some ways it was also painfully familiar. He grew up in a time when kids spent most of their days outside, moving from house to house, riding bikes, getting into trouble in small, careless ways that felt harmless at the time. Parents worked long hours, kids were trusted to entertain themselves. Adults assumed nothing truly terrible could happen during an ordinary afternoon. My dad used to tell me stories about those years, usually light ones. Stories about playing with his friends until it got dark, about scraped knees and stupid dares, about feeling like the world was huge and endless. But there was one story he told me only once, maybe twice. It wasn't framed as a lesson. He didn't soften it or dramatize it. He told it quietly, almost like he was reciting something he had repeated in his head for decades. And even hearing it secondhand, it became one of the most haunting things I've ever known. When he was about 10 years old, he and a group of his friends were hanging out at another boy's house. This wasn't unusual. Kids gathered wherever there was space, snacks, or something interesting to do. This particular friend lived in a house where his father worked long hours and was gone most of the day. Like many adults at the time, the father owned a gun, a loaded pistol. And like many adults back then, he didn't imagine that his child would ever touch it. But the kids knew where it was. My dad told me that the boy whose house it was had shown them before. He knew exactly where his father kept the pistol, and when his father was at work, he would take it out, not to hurt anyone, not because he was angry or malicious, but because he was curious, because it felt powerful, because kids don't understand consequences the way adults do. The gun became something they gathered around, something dangerous but in a distant, abstract way. My dad said the boy would take it out in front of them and play with it, showing it off, holding it like something important. The other kids watched. Some were scared, some excited, some uncomfortable but unsure how to speak up. None of them truly believed the gun could go off. Guns were things you saw in movies, in stories. They weren't real until suddenly they were. One day, it happened again. The boys were there, clustered together in the house, doing what kids do when adults aren't around. The pistol came out, and my dad never went into detail about exactly what the boy was doing with it. He didn't need to. The important part was what followed. The gun went off. There was no warning, no dramatic buildup, just a loud, sudden sound that shattered the room and their understanding of the world all at once. The boy shot himself in the head, right there in front of my dad and his friends. What makes this story unbearable isn't just that a child died. It's what happened in the moments after. My dad told me that his friend didn't die right away. He was still conscious, still aware. He knew exactly what had happened to him. And when my dad described this part, His voice changed in a way I've never forgotten. He said the boy's eyes were wide with terror, not confusion, not shock, but absolute understanding. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes all at once that they have made a mistake they cannot undo. The boys started panicking. My dad said it was clear that he knew he was dying. There was no calm, no peaceful fading, just raw, uncontrollable fear. A child realizing in the worst possible way that life was ending and there was nothing anyone could do about it. And then he died. Right there, in front of a group of 10-year-old boys who had no tools, no understanding, no way to process what they were seeing. One moment they were just kids messing around. The next, they were witnesses to something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. My dad didn't go into detail about what happened immediately afterward. He didn't talk about screaming or running or adults arriving. Maybe because those details don't matter as much. The damage had already been done. The image of his friend's face, the terror in his eyes, the knowledge that he was aware of his own death, that was the part that stayed. When my dad told me this story, I remember feeling physically sick. Even though I wasn't there, even though it happened long before I was born, the weight of it pressed down on me. I couldn't stop imagining it. A child, barely old enough to understand what death truly means, realizing too late that he was about to die. The cruelty of that moment felt unbearable. What haunted me most was thinking about my dad, about him as a 10-year-old kid, standing there, helpless, no adult to explain, no way to unsee it, no way to go back to who he was 5 minutes earlier. Childhood is supposed to be a time of safety, of learning slowly, of being protected from the worst parts of reality. That day ripped all of that away in an instant. I can't imagine what it must have done to my dad and his friends. Kids don't have the language or emotional tools to process trauma like that. They don't sit down and talk through it. They don't get therapy. They go home. They go to bed. They try to sleep. And when they close their eyes, the image is still there. My dad never talked about nightmares, but I can't believe he didn't have them. I can't believe that terror didn't replay in his mind over and over again. The sound of the gun, the look in his friend's eyes, the moment where everything changed. What strikes me now as an adult is how random it all was. There was no intention for harm, no argument, no warning signs that would have been obvious to a child. Just a loaded gun, curiosity, and a single irreversible moment. One mistake that ended a life and permanently scarred several others. That story changed the way I think about trauma. We often focus on the person who dies, and of course, that loss is enormous. But there are also the witnesses, the children who were there, the ones who carried that moment forward into adulthood, shaping who they became in ways they might not even fully understand. When my dad told me that story, he didn't cry, he didn't raise his voice. He just told it plainly, as if it were a fact of his life. Something that had happened and could not be changed. But there was a heaviness to it, a sense that it was still there with him, even all those years later, and now it's with me too. I think about that boy sometimes, about how he probably woke up that morning thinking about normal kid things, about how he had no idea that by the end of the day, his life would be over. I think about his parents, especially his father, who must have lived with an unbearable weight afterward, knowing that something he owned, something he thought was safely put away, ended his child's life. I think about my dad and his friends, carrying that image into adulthood, into relationships, into parenthood. How something like that shapes your understanding of danger, of mortality, of how fragile life really is. The story haunts me, even though it didn't happen to me directly. I can't imagine what it must be like to live with it as a memory of your own childhood, to know that your first real encounter with death wasn't gradual or gentle, but sudden, violent, and filled with terror. It's one of those stories that makes you realize how thin the line is between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy. How a single moment can fracture time into before and after. How childhood innocence isn't always lost slowly, but sometimes ripped away in an instant. Even now, years after my dad told me, I still think about the terror in that boy's eyes, about the realization he must have felt in his final moments, and about the group of children standing there, watching, powerless to help, never able to forget. Some stories don't need monsters or shadows to be horrifying. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened, the ones where the horror comes from a single devastating mistake and the knowledge that nothing can ever make it right again. I grew up in the rural Midwest in the 70s and 80s, in a time and place that feels almost unreal now. I was a kid, then a teenager, and for years I regularly babysat for family and close family friends. Everyone knew everyone. Our houses sat far apart, surrounded by fields, gravel roads, and long stretches of quiet. Nights were dark and still, and days moved slowly, marked by chores, school, and small-town routines. Back then, people trusted their neighbors in a way that feels impossible now. Doors were rarely locked, even at night. Cars sat in driveways with the keys still in the ignition. It wasn't carelessness, at least not how it felt to us. It was simply how life was, safe, familiar, predictable. One of the families I knew during that time lived not far from us. I didn't babysit for them, but our families crossed paths often enough that I got to know them. The mother had a friend who would visit sometimes, and I met her a few times over the years. She stood out to me because she was kind and warm, the sort of person who smiled easily and seemed genuinely interested in whoever she was talking to. She was pretty in a soft, everyday way, not flashy, just someone who looked comfortable in her own skin. She also had a little girl, who everyone noticed right away. The girl was adorable, with bright eyes and an open, cheerful way about her, the kind of child people instinctively smiled at. Even before I met them, I knew their family had gone through something terrible. In a place that small, tragedies didn't stay private. They moved quietly from house to house, shared in hushed conversations, passed along with sympathy and sorrow. A couple of years before I ever met the mother and her remaining daughter, there had been an accident, one that no one ever forgot. The story was always told carefully, as if choosing the wrong words might somehow make it worse. The mother had been backing out of her driveway one ordinary day. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have set off alarms. Her toddler, the older sister of the little girl I later met, had been playing behind the car. The mother didn't see her. In a matter of seconds, without any chance to stop it, she backed over her own child. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. The toddler died. Even now, decades later, it's hard to think about without feeling sick. It was the kind of tragedy that shattered more than just a moment. It broke a family in ways that could never fully be repaired. There was no one to blame in the usual sense. No villain, no intention. Just a terrible accident and a mother who had to live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. In a small town, everyone felt it. People brought casseroles, spoke in whispers, hugged a little tighter. But once the food was eaten and the shock faded, that family was left alone with their grief. By the time I met them, a few years had passed. On the surface, they seemed to be doing what people always say you're supposed to do after something awful happens. They carried on. They raised their remaining daughter. They tried to rebuild some version of a normal life. From the outside, it looked like they were healing, or at least learning how to live with the pain. The little girl was happy, or happy enough, and the parents did their best to give her a safe, loving childhood. Still, everyone knew there was a weight in that house that never fully lifted. Life went on, as it always does, even after unimaginable loss. Seasons changed. Summers came and went. The memory of the accident remained, but it became part of the background, something people remembered without always talking about. In those days, the world felt smaller and slower, and danger felt far away. Crimes like home invasions or violent attacks were things you heard about on the news, happening in cities, not in places like ours. That illusion of safety was shattered one random summer night. It was the middle of the night, quiet in the way rural nights are quiet. No traffic, no sirens, just insects and the occasional distant sound carried over the fields. That night, someone walked into their house. There was no forced entry, no broken window, no splintered doorframe. He simply walked in because the door was unlocked, just as it always was. What happened next was every family's worst nightmare, and it unfolded in the very place that was supposed to be safest. The intruder confronted the parents. The father was overpowered and tied up. He was restrained in such a way that he couldn't intervene, couldn't protect his wife, couldn't do anything but watch. The man assaulted the mother brutally, right there in their own home, on the dining room table where the family shared meals, talked about their days, tried to build some sense of normalcy after their earlier loss. The violence of it is hard to put into words, and even harder to fully comprehend. The cruelty wasn't just in the act itself, but in the way the attacker forced the father to witness it. That kind of trauma doesn't end when the attacker leaves. It embeds itself into memory, into relationships, into every corner of a person's life. The house itself, once a place of comfort, became something else entirely. The only small mercy in that night, if it can even be called that, was that their daughter never woke up. The little girl slept through the entire ordeal. She didn't hear the sounds, didn't see the fear, didn't understand what was happening just a few rooms away. When people later spoke about it, this detail was always mentioned, as if clinging to it provided some tiny relief in an otherwise unbearable story. At least the child was spared that moment, people would say. At least she didn't have to carry that memory. But even that mercy feels fragile when you think about it. Children sense more than we give them credit for. Even if she didn't wake up, even if she never knew the details, the aftermath would have changed everything around her. Her parents would have been different after that night. The house would have felt different. Safety would no longer be a given. When news of what happened spread, it hit the community hard. People were stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in a place where doors stayed unlocked and everyone trusted one another. Fear crept in quietly at first, then settled in for good. People started locking their doors. Keys disappeared from ignitions. Porch lights stayed on at night. Something fundamental had shifted. I was young, but old enough to understand that this wasn't just a bad story or a shocking headline. It was real people, people I had seen and spoken to, whose lives had been torn open again after they had already endured something unimaginable. The unfairness of it was overwhelming. First the accident, a moment of horror that no one could undo, and then, years later, a deliberate act of violence that stripped away any sense of peace they might have rebuilt. Looking back now, what stays with me most is the contrast. Before that night, their story was already tragic, but it was the kind of tragedy people tried to wrap in understanding and compassion. An accident, a horrible mistake. After that night, there was no way to soften what had happened. It was intentional, cruel, and senseless. It took a family that had already been broken and shattered them all over again. I don't know what became of them in the years that followed. In small towns, people move away quietly, or stay and learn how to live with the stares and the whispered sympathy. I don't know if they were able to heal or if they ever felt safe again in their own home. I don't know how the little girl grew up or what she was told about that night, or what she sensed without being told anything at all. What I do know is that the story never left me. Even now, decades later, it comes back to me sometimes, uninvited. It comes back when people talk about the good old days and how things used to be safer, simpler. It reminds me that safety is often an illusion, one we cling to until something proves otherwise. It reminds me how fragile normal life really is, and how quickly it can be torn apart, even in places that feel protected from the rest of the world. That family's story became part of the quiet history of our town, something people remembered but rarely discussed in detail. But for those of us who knew them, or knew of them, it lingered as a warning and a sorrow. It was a reminder that tragedy doesn't follow rules, and that sometimes, even after surviving the worst thing you can imagine, life can still find new ways to hurt you. And maybe that's the hardest part of all. Not just that such terrible things happen, but that they can happen to the same people, over and over, without reason or fairness. A mother who lived with the guilt of a terrible accident. A father who was forced to watch something no one should ever have to witness. A child whose life was shaped by loss and fear before she was old enough to understand either. In a place that once felt safe, their story changed everything. And even now, when I think back to those quiet Midwestern nights, I remember that illusion of safety and how easily it was broken. When my grandpa was about 15 years old, his life was split cleanly into a before and an after, even if he didn't have the words for it at the time. He was still a kid, old enough to understand when something was wrong, but far too young to be forced to witness the kind of violence that would stay with him for the rest of his life. His mother, my great-grandmother, was in the process of divorcing his stepdad. By the time things reached that point, the marriage had already become unbearable. Her husband was deeply manipulative and controlling, the kind of man who needed to dominate every part of another person's life. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted proof. He needed to know where she was, who she spoke to, and whether her stories matched his expectations. Yeah, one of the things my grandpa always mentioned when he talked about that time was how his stepdad would track the mileage on my great-grandmother's car. He would write down the number, then check it again later, making sure the distance added up with wherever she claimed to have gone. If it didn't, he would accuse her of lying. It wasn't about catching her in anything specific. It was about control, about making her feel watched at all times, even when he wasn't physically there. Living in that house meant living in constant tension. There was no real sense of safety, only a careful routine of avoiding conflict where possible and bracing for it when it wasn't. By the time the divorce began, things were already volatile. Emotions were high. Anger, resentment, and fear hung in the air constantly. My grandpa, still a teenager, could sense that something was deeply wrong, even if no one said it out loud. Then came the day that changed everything. My great-grandmother believed her husband was coming by to pick up some of his belongings. That kind of thing was common during a separation. It didn't immediately raise alarms. There was no warning that this visit would be different from the others, no indication that it would turn violent. My grandpa was there when his stepdad arrived. What happened next unfolded fast, but not so fast that it could be blocked out or forgotten. Instead of gathering his things and leaving, his stepdad pulled out a gun. Without any real argument or build-up that my grandpa could remember, he started shooting. My great-grandmother was shot multiple times, in the head, in the chest. My grandpa witnessed the entire thing. At 15 years old, he stood there and watched a man he lived with try to murder his mother. There was no time to react, no chance to intervene, no way to process what was happening in the moment. 1 second she was alive and standing there, and the next she was collapsing under gunfire. For a teenager, that kind of image doesn't just scare you, it rewires you. It destroys any remaining belief that adults are always in control or that home is always a safe place. My grandpa never described the scene in graphic detail, but he didn't need to. The horror was already clear. The shock, the panic, the helplessness of watching and not being able to stop it. After the shooting, everything became chaos. There were screams, someone called for help, emergency responders arrived. My great-grandmother was rushed for medical treatment. No one expected her to survive. Being shot multiple times in the head and chest was usually a death sentence, especially at that time. And yet, she lived. That's the part that still feels almost impossible to believe. Against all odds, my great-grandmother survived the attack. The bullets didn't kill her. She endured surgeries, recovery, and the long aftermath of trauma, both physical and emotional. The damage was real, and she carried it for the rest of her life. But she did not die that day. She went on to live a fairly long life after that. That fact alone feels unreal when you think about what she went through. A woman who endured years of manipulation and control, survived an attempted murder in front of her child, and still managed to keep living afterward. The strength that must have taken is hard to fully understand. For my grandpa, though, survival didn't mean the story was over. He had seen something no child should ever see. He had watched a man attempt to kill his mother. Even though she lived, the damage to him was already done. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the victim survives. In some ways, it lingers even more because the memory never gets softened by finality. He grew up carrying that moment with him. He didn't talk about it often. When he did, it was usually brief, factual, and stripped of emotion. The way people talk about things that hurt too much to revisit deeply. But it shaped him. It shaped how he saw anger, control, and violence. It shaped how protective he was of his family later in life. It shaped how seriously he took threats and warning signs in people. There's also something especially haunting about the randomness of it. One moment the visit was supposed to be about picking up belongings. The next, it was an attempted murder. That kind of sudden shift leaves you permanently on edge. It teaches you that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in pretending to be something normal. The man who did it was exactly the kind of person people often underestimate. Controlling, manipulative, obsessed with power. The divorce represented a loss of control, and he couldn't accept it. For people like that, separation isn't just rejection, it's humiliation. And humiliation, combined with entitlement and rage, can become deadly. What makes the story even harder to sit with is knowing my grandpa had to grow up after that. Life didn't pause to let him process what he'd seen. He still had to become an adult, build a life, and carry on as if that moment wasn't always sitting just beneath the surface of his memories. My great-grandmother surviving didn't erase what happened. It didn't make it less violent or less traumatic. It just meant that instead of mourning her, my grandpa had to live with the memory of nearly losing her and the knowledge of exactly how close he came. When people talk about domestic violence as something private or contained, stories like this show how wrong that is. The damage spreads outward, it reaches children, it reshapes families, it leaves scars that last for generations. What stays with me the most is imagining my grandpa at 15, standing there watching his world collapse in real time. A kid who should have been worrying about school or friends, instead learning how fragile life really is. Learning how dangerous people can become when they feel they're losing control. And then there's my great-grandmother, a woman who endured years of abuse, survived an attempted execution, and still lived on. Her survival doesn't erase the horror of what happened, but it adds a strange, powerful layer to the story. She wasn't just a victim. She was someone who refused, even unintentionally, to die when someone decided she should. She lived long enough to become more than just that moment. Long enough for my grandpa to have more memories of her than just the worst one. Long enough for her life to continue beyond violence, even if the shadow of it never fully disappeared. The story is horrifying, but it's also a reminder of how strong people can be in ways we don't always see, and how deeply violence can mark those who witness it, even when the outcome is survival. It's one of those family stories that never really fades. It gets quieter over time, told less often, but it never truly goes away. It lives in the way people are cautious, in the way they protect each other, in the way they understand that sometimes the most dangerous moments come from the people closest to us. And the fact that my great-grandmother lived, that she went on after something so unimaginable, is still the craziest part of all. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. Back in 2011, my parents had just bought a small farm in the middle of nowhere. When I say nowhere, I really mean it. No nearby towns, no streetlights, no traffic noise, nothing that made it feel connected to the rest of the world. At that time, my dad was still working in California and hadn't moved yet, so it was just my mom and me living in the new house. It was supposed to be a fresh start, something peaceful and quiet. But moving from a city into that kind of isolation was more unsettling than either of us expected. The house sat at the very end of a dead-end gravel road. Once you reached our driveway, there was nowhere else to go. No houses past us, no reason for anyone to drive by unless they were coming directly to our place. The land around the house was heavily wooded, thick with trees that blocked out what little moonlight there was at night. During the day, it was beautiful in a wild, untouched way, but at night it felt like the woods closed in around the house. Sounds carried strangely out there, and silence felt heavier than it ever had in the city. It was our first week living there, and the house needed a lot of work. There were repairs to make, cleaning to do, and endless little projects that drained our energy. Because of that, my mom and I were exhausted every night. We went to bed early, earlier than we ever would have back in the city, simply because there was nothing else to do once the sun went down. No quick trips to the store, no nearby neighbors to visit, just darkness and quiet. One night, not long after we had gone to bed, everything changed. We were already asleep when, sometime after 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud at first, but in the kind of silence that surrounded the house, it might as well have been a shout. Almost immediately, our dog went crazy. We had an Australian Shepherd, but she was often mistaken for a Rottweiler because of her coloring and build. She was large, strong, and extremely aggressive with strangers. She didn't bark just to bark. When she barked like that, it meant she felt threatened. The sound of her barking jolted both my mom and me fully awake. My heart was already racing before I even sat up in bed. We both knew instantly that something was wrong. No one should have been knocking on our door that late, especially not out there. It was pitch black outside, and we were two women alone in a house surrounded by woods. As we got out of bed, fear set in quickly. Every worst-case thought rushed through my mind at once. Who would come to a house like ours after 10 at night? How did they even find us? We hadn't met any neighbors yet. We barely knew the area. The isolation that had seemed peaceful during the day now felt dangerous. Our dog was losing her mind, barking and growling as she ran toward the front door. My mom moved fast, but stayed calm. She reached for her handgun, something she had insisted on keeping close after the move, and tucked it behind her back. She didn't wave it around or panic. She was focused, steady and serious in a way I had never seen before. I followed her down the hallway, my hands shaking as I tried to grab the dog's collar and hold her back. Getting to our front door wasn't simple. Anyone who wanted to knock had to pull into our private driveway, get out of their vehicle, walk up onto our deck, and go through a closed, gated area before they could even reach the door. Nothing about it was welcoming, especially at night. That made the situation even more terrifying. Whoever was out there had gone out of their way to reach us. My mom cracked the door open just enough to see the person standing there. I stayed behind her, using everything I had to keep the dog from lunging forward. She was snarling, barking, and pulling against me so hard my arms were burning. The man at the door looked ordinary at first glance. Middle-aged, nothing about him immediately screamed danger. But there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. He smiled and said he was our neighbor and that he just wanted to welcome us to the area. At 10 o'clock at night, my mom thanked him politely but briefly. She clearly wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. She tried to close the door, but he stopped it with his hand. That was the moment my fear turned into full-blown panic. Every alarm in my head was screaming that this was not okay. Our dog went even crazier. I could barely hold her back now, her whole body tense and ready to attack. The man didn't seem bothered by her at all, which somehow made things worse. Instead of backing away, he started talking faster, his tone shifting. He began claiming that he owned part of our land. He said the well on the property belonged to him. He went on and on, saying things that made no sense, jumping from one claim to another. It felt less like a conversation and more like he was testing us, seeing how we would react. My mom told him firmly that he needed to leave. She didn't raise her voice, but there was no friendliness left in it. He refused. He just stood there, blocking the door, ignoring her, and continuing his strange rant. I could feel the dog shaking beneath my hands, ready to explode forward if I let go. That's when my mom made her move. She pulled the gun out from behind her back, pointed it at him, and told him very clearly to leave. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't hesitate. She said that if he didn't leave immediately, she would shoot him and then let the dog go. For a split second, everything was frozen. The man's expression changed completely. The friendliness vanished, replaced by shock and anger. Then he started screaming. He turned and ran, stumbling off the deck and sprinting down our driveway toward the road. As he ran, he yelled something that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. He shouted that the bitch has a gun, and that was when we realized he hadn't come alone. There were other people with him waiting somewhere out of sight. My mom slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone, but I called the police immediately. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting someone to come back. We could hear vehicles starting up, tires crunching on gravel as they drove away. The woods swallowed the sound quickly, leaving us alone again in the darkness. Every shadow looked like a person. Every noise made me jump. Amazingly, a deputy was already in the area. Before the truck even made it out of the private road, the police stopped them. Later, we found out the man was given a trespass warning. That was it. No arrest, no dramatic ending, just a warning and a reminder of how close something truly terrible could have come. That night was one of the scariest moments of my life. Even after the police left, I couldn't sleep. I sat there replaying everything over and over in my head. What if my mom hadn't had her gun? What if she had hesitated? What if the dog hadn't been there? The outcome could have been very different. What stuck with me most was how calm my mom had been. She didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She was ready to protect us no matter what. Seeing that changed how I looked at her forever. And yes, it turned out the man really was a neighbor. He owned the lot next to our property, though there was no house on it, no utilities, nothing permanent. He just camped there occasionally when he passed through the area every year or so. Knowing that didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse. It meant someone like that could be that close to us, watching, knowing where we lived. After that night, the farm never felt the same. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense, waiting. Doors were always locked. Lights stayed on longer. And I learned a lesson I've never forgotten. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. And sometimes the scariest things don't come from the woods. They come knocking at your door. It happened on a Friday night, and even now it still doesn't feel real when I think about how close it came to going very, very wrong. I keep replaying it in my head, not because I want to, but because my brain seems determined to remind me just how thin the line was between an uncomfortable moment and something far worse. Earlier that night, a group of friends and I had been out drinking. Nothing wild or unusual, just one of those long nights where time blurs together, conversations loop, and you don't realize how exhausted you are until the adrenaline finally wears off. By the time everything started winding down, I was tired, slightly drunk, and ready to be done for the night. That's when one of our friends realized her car wouldn't start. It wasn't a huge crisis. We were all nearby. Sure, and a couple of people offered to help jump-start it. We parked, got out, and started getting things ready. While everyone else focused on the car, I realized I was still dressed in the nice clothes I'd worn earlier in the night. They were uncomfortable, tight, and at that point felt ridiculous for standing around a dark street trying to deal with a dead battery. My friend lived just across the street. It felt harmless, almost laughably harmless. I told everyone I was going to run across, change into something more comfortable, and come right back. It wasn't even a full block away, just across the street into her place and back out. I didn't think twice about it. I crossed over, changed quickly, and stepped back outside. The night air felt heavier now, quieter. The streetlights cast that dull yellow glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. My friends were still where I'd left them, clustered around the car, talking and laughing as they worked. I started walking back toward them. That's when I noticed the car. At first, it didn't register as a threat. It was just a vehicle driving down the street, something you barely acknowledge. Then the driver slowed. Then he waved at me. Not a friendly wave, not a quick acknowledgement. It was deliberate, repeated, clearly meant to get my attention. My stomach tightened instantly. I didn't wave back. I didn't smile. I didn't respond at all. I just kept walking, picking up my pace slightly, hoping he'd lose interest and keep driving. People wave at strangers sometimes. I told myself not to overreact. I told myself I was probably misreading it. Then he put his car in reverse. I heard the engine change pitch. I saw the brake lights flash, and suddenly the car was moving backward, following me as I walked forward. That was the moment fear hit me full force. Not unease, not discomfort, pure, sharp terror, the kind that floods your body all at once, leaving no room for doubt or rationalization. Every instinct in me screamed that this was wrong, that this man should not be doing this, that I was not safe. I started walking faster. He reversed faster. I could hear the tires crunching slightly on the pavement as he kept pace with me. The distance between us didn't grow. If anything, it felt like it was closing. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was in my throat. My thoughts scattered, but one thing was crystal clear. I needed attention. I needed witnesses. I needed noise. So I screamed. Not something polite, not something subtle. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help! This man is trying to prostitute me!" The words came out raw and frantic, not planned, not filtered. It was the first thing my panicking brain could grab onto that sounded shocking enough to make people look. At first, my friends laughed. They were drunk too. They assumed I was joking. They thought I was being dramatic or messing around because that's how it sounded in isolation. A drunk friend yelling something ridiculous into the night. But then they looked up, and they saw the car. They saw it speeding in reverse toward me. They saw how close it was. They saw that this wasn't a joke. The laughter stopped instantly. I could feel the shift even without looking at them. The air changed. What had been casual and noisy became tense and focused. I wasn't alone anymore, not in the way the man had probably assumed I was. I think he saw it too. I think the moment he realized I wasn't by myself, that I had a group of people watching, that there were witnesses and potential consequences, something changed in him. He slammed on the brakes, shifted gears, and sped off down the street, disappearing almost as quickly as he'd appeared. It was over just like that. No confrontation, no explanation, no chance to understand what his intentions truly were. Just the sudden absence of danger and the sickening realization of what might have happened if things had gone even slightly differently. I made it back to my friends, shaking. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. My legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath me. Adrenaline was still surging through me, making everything feel too bright, too loud, too sharp. Everyone was suddenly talking at once. Did you see that? What the hell was that guy doing? Are you okay? Someone put a hand on my shoulder. Someone else swore loudly and looked down the street as if the car might come back. The mood had completely changed. The jump start no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except the fact that something had just happened that none of us were prepared for. At the time, I tried to laugh it off a little. I was drunk. I didn't want to fully process how scared I was, but inside, I felt hollow, violated, even though nothing physical had happened. Just the knowledge that someone had singled me out, followed me, and felt entitled to approach me like that was enough to make my skin crawl. Later, after things calmed down, one of my friends said something that made my blood run cold all over again. She told me that while she was waiting for us to come help jumpstart her car, she'd noticed the same man driving around the neighborhood, circling, passing by more than once, slow enough to be noticeable. That meant what happened to me wasn't random. He hadn't just happened to see me and act on impulse. He had already been watching, already been looking, waiting for an opportunity. And I had handed him one without realizing it by walking alone, even for just a minute. That thought is what really stays with me. I keep thinking about how small the gap was, how close my friends were, how short the distance was between the two houses, how easy it was to assume I'd be fine. I keep thinking about how tired I was, how intoxicated, nay, how distracted, how vulnerable all of that made me without me even realizing it. If my friends hadn't been outside, if they'd been inside grabbing cables, if I'd crossed the street a minute earlier or later, if I hadn't screamed. There are too many versions of that night that don't end the same way. What scares me most is how quickly it escalated. There was no slow buildup, no chance to assess. One moment I was walking, the next moment I was being followed by a car in reverse. It didn't feel like harassment. It felt like the opening move of something much worse. I've replayed his face in my head, though I didn't really see it clearly. I remember the shape of the car more than the man himself. I remember the headlights, the sound of the engine, the way the car matched my speed. I remember how small I felt in that moment, how exposed. Even now, days later, my body still reacts when I think about it. My chest tightens, my stomach knots, my shoulders tense like I'm bracing for something. It's strange how fear lingers, even when logic tells you the danger has passed. Nothing physically happened to me, and I know that. But that doesn't mean it didn't matter. It doesn't mean it wasn't real. It doesn't mean it didn't change something in me. I'm more aware now, hyper-aware. Every car that slows down too much catches my attention. Every unexpected sound behind me makes my heart jump. I hate that someone I'll never see again gets to leave that mark on me without consequence. What angers me is how normal the situation was. Helping a friend, changing clothes, walking across the street. These are things people do every day without thinking twice. And yet, in that moment, it was enough to put me in danger. So, yeah, I'm saying it out loud now, even if it sounds obvious. Don't walk alone at night, even if it's just across the street, even if your friends are nearby, even if you think it'll only take a minute, even if you've done it 100 times before without issue. Because all it takes is one person, one moment, one bad decision by someone else, and everything can change. I was lucky. Incredibly lucky. I had people with me. I had my voice. I had enough presence of mind, even while drunk and terrified, to scream and draw attention. Not everyone gets that chance. And the fact that I was almost kidnapped on an ordinary Friday night, during a moment I barely thought about at the time, is something I don't think I'll ever fully forget. One of the strangest and most unsettling stories from my childhood is one that I don't actually remember clearly myself, at least not the beginning of it. Most of what I know comes from what my parents told me later, from bits and pieces that surfaced over the years, and from a few sharp memories that stuck with me even though I was very young at the time. It's one of those stories that feels almost unreal when you look back on it, like something that shouldn't have happened in an ordinary family's life, but somehow did. My dad was an alcoholic back then. That fact shaped a lot of things about our home, both in obvious ways and in quieter ones. He had a deep sense of sympathy for people who were struggling, especially men who reminded him of himself. Drifters, hitchhikers, guys down on their luck. He saw them as people who just needed a break, a meal, a little kindness. In his mind, helping them wasn't just generosity, it was a kind of responsibility. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker and brought him home. This wasn't unusual for my dad. He had done it before, and for a while, he would keep doing it afterward too. But this particular man was different. Even as a child, I remember there being something off about him. I couldn't have explained it at the time, but I remember feeling uneasy. The kind of uneasy that makes you want to stay close to your mom without knowing why. My dad brought the man into our house and told my mom to feed him and let him wash his clothes. That was the routine. A hot meal, a shower, clean clothes, basic kindness. The guy took a shower, sat at our table, ate the food my mom made, and drank with my dad. My dad always drank with them. Booze was part of the hospitality, part of the bonding. The man was creepy. That's the only word that really fits. There was something in the way he talked, the way he looked at people, the way he carried himself. Not loud or aggressive, just wrong. Like he didn't quite belong in normal life. My mom noticed it too. She didn't like him. She didn't trust him. But at that point, he was already in our house, already being treated like a guest. After that first visit, he left. Life went on, but every time he was back in the area, he would stop by. At first, it probably didn't seem like a big deal to my dad. He saw it as loyalty, a guy who remembered kindness and came back to say hello. The man would drink with my dad, sometimes heavily. As the drinking went on over multiple visits, things got darker. One night, after getting very drunk with my dad, the man confessed something that changed everything. He told my dad that he had killed his wife. Then he said he had later killed his girlfriend too. He claimed he had buried both of them under the kitchen floor in his home. And he said he was on the run from the law. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for my dad to hear that. Sitting in his own house, drunk, face to face with a man he had invited in, realizing that the person across from him was claiming to be a murderer. Not a story from the news, not something far away, someone sitting at his table. That confession sobered my dad up fast. Whatever denial or drunken fog he had been living in disappeared in that moment. He suddenly understood how dangerous the situation might be, not just for himself, but for my mom, my sister, and me. So he told the man to leave. Then he turned to my mom and told her to take my sister and me to my grandparents' house. He didn't want us anywhere near the house until he knew the situation was handled. He told her to wait until he called and said it was safe for us to come home. I remember being taken to my grandparents' house, though at the time I didn't understand why. I was very young, maybe 4 years old. What stands out to me isn't fear or panic, but confusion. Kids sense when something is wrong, even if they don't know what it is. On the way to my grandparents' house, my mom stopped at a pancake place. It was like an IHOP, but a small local mom-and-pop restaurant. We never went there before or after that day. That's how I know this memory is tied to something important. It's burned into my mind because it was unusual. I remember sitting in a booth, the smell of coffee and syrup in the air, the clatter of dishes. I remember my mom being quieter than usual, tense, focused. At the time, it felt like an odd little adventure. Looking back, I realize it was probably her trying to keep things normal for us while her world was spinning. Back at home, my dad called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. He had taken off before they could get there. According to what I was told later, the police took the report seriously, but there wasn't much they could do in that moment. The man had disappeared. There was no immediate evidence. Just a drunken confession made to another drunk man. Supposedly, he was later caught somewhere around Amarillo, Texas. That's what my parents believed. But there were never any newspaper articles that anyone could find. No clear confirmation, no closure, just a story that ended with, "I think they caught him." That uncertainty makes the whole thing even more unsettling. The idea that someone could confess to multiple murders, vanish, and leave behind nothing but rumors and memories is deeply disturbing. What stayed with me most wasn't just the confession, but how real it felt in our family afterward. My dad didn't treat it like a drunken joke. He didn't brush it off. He acted like a man who believed he had let something truly dangerous into his home. For a while, things changed. There was tension, a sense that something bad had come very close to us without us realizing it at the time. I don't remember exactly when we went back home, only that eventually we did. What's strange is that even after that, my dad didn't stop helping hitchhikers. You would think that bringing a supposed murderer into your home would end that habit forever. For most people, it probably would. But my dad was complicated. His alcoholism, his sense of guilt, his belief that he was somehow responsible for helping lost souls, all of that stayed with him. We had a couple more hitchhikers join us for holiday barbecues over the years, men my dad had picked up and decided to include. My sister and I were not allowed to be around them unless one of our parents was present. That rule alone tells me how uneasy my mom was. Even if she didn't always fight my dad on it openly, those gatherings felt strange. Adults laughing, drinking, acting normal, while an unspoken tension sat under everything. As kids, we didn't know the details, but we knew there were rules. Don't go off alone. Don't talk too much. Stay where we can see you. Eventually, when I was a teenager, my dad stopped bringing hitchhikers home. I don't know exactly what changed. Maybe he got older. Maybe he got tired. Maybe he finally realized how dangerous it was. Or maybe he just ran out of excuses to keep doing it. Looking back now as an adult, the story hits differently than it did when I first heard it. As a kid, it was just another strange family story. As an adult, it's horrifying. The idea that a man who claimed to have murdered 2 women sat at our table, ate our food, drank with my dad, and spent time in our house is almost impossible to fully process. The idea that my mom, my sister, and I were there, vulnerable, unaware, makes my stomach turn. At the same time, I see my dad more clearly now. I see how his alcoholism blurred his judgment, how his desire to see himself as a helper A good man doing good things put his family at risk. How one moment of clarity saved us from something that could have gone very differently. There's also something deeply unsettling about the lack of proof. No articles, no names, no confirmation, just a confession and a disappearance. It leaves room for doubt, but not enough to bring comfort. Because even if the man was lying, even if he exaggerated or made it up, the fact that he would say something like that at all says enough. What haunts me most is how close danger can come without announcing itself. It didn't kick down the door. It didn't arrive with sirens or warning signs. It showed up with a thumb out on the side of the road and a sad story that made my dad feel sympathy. I think about that sometimes when people talk about evil as something obvious, something you can spot right away. In my experience and in my family's story, it wasn't obvious at all. It was quiet. It was invited in. It ate dinner with us. That memory of the pancake house still sticks with me. The warmth of the booth, the normalcy of it. The fact that my mom was trying to protect us without scaring us. It's such a small, ordinary detail in the middle of something dark, but maybe that's why it stands out. It was a pause, a moment of safety while something dangerous was being dealt with elsewhere. Even now, decades later, I think about how thin the line was. One confession, one decision by my dad to finally act. One choice to send us away instead of pretending everything was fine. My dad made a lot of mistakes in his life. Now, bringing strangers home was one of them. But that day when it mattered most, he did the right thing. He recognized the danger. He protected his family. And because of that, all we're left with is a story that unsettles us instead of something far worse. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things don't look scary at first. Sometimes they show up hungry, tired, and asking for help. And sometimes the moment you realize who they really are is the moment everything in your life changes. When my mom talks about her childhood in the 1980s, most of her memories sound like what you'd expect. Riding bikes until the streetlights came on, hanging out with friends without adults hovering nearby, doing dumb, harmless things just because no one was around to stop them. She grew up in a time when kids had freedom, sometimes too much of it, and the world still felt mostly safe, at least on the surface. But there is one night she told me about that never left her. Even now, decades later, she describes it as one of the scariest things she has ever seen. Not scary in a vague, uneasy way, but the kind of fear that locks itself into your memory and never fully fades. She was around 12 or 13 at the time, old enough to feel brave, young enough to have no real understanding of danger. That night, she was with a group of friends at one of their houses. It was a normal evening, the kind that starts with laughter and boredom and slowly turns into kids looking for something to do. No one wanted to go home yet. No one wanted the night to end. The house sat near a heavily wooded area, thick trees, uneven ground, the kind of woods that felt endless once you stepped inside them. During the day, it was just trees and dirt and shadows. At night, it was something else entirely. Still, being kids, they didn't think much of it. Someone suggested they go exploring. Someone else agreed. Before anyone could talk themselves out of it, they were heading toward the tree line. They didn't bring flashlights. They didn't tell any adults where they were going. It wasn't unusual. Kids wandered back then. But parents trusted that nothing truly bad would happen. The girls moved into the woods, laughing at first, pushing branches aside, joking about how brave they were. The darkness pressed in quickly once the house lights disappeared behind them. The woods were quiet in that way that only deep, thick woods can be quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, just still. Every snapped twig sounded loud. Every rustle felt closer than it should. But they kept going, feeding off each other's nerves, pretending not to be scared. At some point, they started going uphill. The ground sloped upward, forcing them to slow down. Trees thinned slightly as they climbed, and when they finally reached the top, they noticed something strange. Below them, past the edge of the hill, was a clearing. That alone was unusual. Clearings don't just appear naturally in dense woods. Someone had made that space. As they looked down, they noticed a fire burning in the middle of it. The flames flickered and cast an orange glow across the clearing, lighting up shapes that made my mom's stomach drop. There were people down there, a lot of them. She said it looked like around 15 people, maybe more, all standing in a loose circle around the fire. They were wearing long robes with hoods pulled up over their heads. The fabric hung down and moved slightly in the firelight. Their faces were mostly hidden, shadows filling the spaces where expressions should have been. For a moment, none of the girls spoke. They just stared, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It didn't fit into anything they understood. It wasn't a party, it wasn't camping. It didn't look like adults just hanging out. There was something deliberate about the way they stood, about the circle, about the fire itself. My mom said the air felt wrong, heavy, like they had stepped into something they were never meant to see. Then one of her friends screamed. It wasn't a planned scream. It wasn't dramatic. It was pure instinctive fear bursting out of a child who suddenly realized how exposed they were. The sound cut through the woods and echoed down into the clearing. Everything changed instantly. The group around the fire stopped what they were doing. All at once, their heads turned upward, toward the hill, toward the girls. Even from that distance, my mom could feel the moment they were noticed. It was like being singled out by a predator, like the woods themselves had turned against them. The robed figures began to move. At first, it was slow, a few steps. Then more of them joined in. They started walking toward the base of the hill, looking up, clearly aware of where the girls were standing. As they moved, they began chanting. The words were simple, but that didn't make them any less terrifying. Join us. Over and over again. Join us. My mom said the sound carried unnaturally well through the woods. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken in unison, calm and steady, which somehow made it worse. There was no anger in it, no excitement, just certainty. That was when the girls ran. They didn't stop to think. They didn't look back at first. They turned and bolted down the hill, branches whipping at their faces, feet slipping on dirt and leaves. Panic took over completely. My mom said she had never run that fast in her life, before or since. Behind them, the chanting continued. Join us. She couldn't tell if the group was following them up the hill or just moving closer beneath it. In her fear, it didn't matter. All she knew was that people in robes had seen them, called out to them, and were moving in their direction. Every horror story a kid could imagine crashed together in her mind at once. She didn't know what those people were. She didn't know what they wanted. She only knew that she didn't want to find out. The woods felt endless as they ran. Trees blurred together. The darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet ahead. My mom said she could hear her own breathing, ragged and loud, and the pounding of her heart in her ears. She was terrified of falling, of tripping, of being the one who couldn't keep up. Finally, through the trees, they saw the glow of the house lights. That sight saved them. It gave them direction, something real to run toward. They burst out of the woods, gasping, crying, stumbling into the yard like they had escaped something alive. They didn't stop until they were inside. The door slammed shut and locked behind them. For a while, no one spoke. They just stood there, shaking, trying to catch their breath. When they finally started talking, it was chaotic. Everyone talking at once. Everyone trying to explain what they saw, what they heard, how close it felt. They never went back into those woods. Not that night. Not ever. My mom told me that even later, when she tried to think about it logically, nothing about it made sense. She didn't know much about cults. Neither did her parents. This was Pennsylvania in the mid-1980s, not some place people associated with robed gatherings in the woods. There were rumors. Of course, stories kids told each other, but nothing that prepared her for what she actually saw. She doesn't know who those people were. She doesn't know what they were doing. She doesn't know if they were harmless or dangerous or somewhere in between. All she knows is how it felt. The sight of that fire, the robes, the way they turned as one, the sound of their voices chanting together in the dark. That feeling never left her. Even now, as an adult, she avoids wooded areas at night. She doesn't like bonfires she can't see clearly. She doesn't like chanting, even in movies. Something about it takes her right back to that hill, looking down into a clearing she should never have seen. What makes the story even more unsettling is that there was no resolution, no explanation. No adult ever confirmed what it was. The police weren't called. Parents were told, but it was written off as kids seeing something weird, maybe adults playing a prank, maybe a misunderstanding. But my mom knows what she saw. She saw people in robes gathered around a fire deep in the woods. She heard them chant. She felt the shift when they realized they were being watched, and she felt the terror of being noticed by something unknown. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones with clear answers. They're the ones that leave questions behind. Who were they? Why were they there? What would have happened if no one had screamed? If the girls had stayed silent just a few seconds longer? My mom doesn't like to think about those questions. Neither do I. All she knows is that she was a kid, standing in the woods with her friends, when the world suddenly showed her that there were things out there she didn't understand, things that didn't need to chase you to be terrifying, things that only had to notice you. And that night, whatever was in that clearing noticed them. The idea of cave diving has always frightened me, but the story of what happened in Norway in 2014 takes that fear to another level. Just thinking about it makes my chest feel tight. It's one of those incidents where the facts alone are terrifying, even before you try to imagine what it must have felt like to actually be there, deep underground, surrounded by rock, water, darkness, and no easy way out. On February 6th, 2014, a group of 6 experienced Finnish cave divers traveled to Norway to dive in the Pluragrata cave system. Pluragrata is located in Rana in northern Norway, and it is not just any cave. It is the deepest known cave system in northern Europe, reaching depths of around 130 meters. That depth alone makes it dangerous. Add to that the fact that it is a flooded cave system with narrow passages, unpredictable conditions, freezing water, and limited visibility, and it becomes clear that this is a place where even small mistakes can be fatal. Cave diving is already considered one of the most dangerous forms of diving in the world. Unlike open water diving, you can't simply ascend to the surface if something goes wrong. You are trapped inside rock. Your only way out is the same way you came in. In a cave like Pluragrata, that route can involve tight squeezes, long distances, and complex navigation. At great depth, every breath depends on your equipment working perfectly. There is no room for panic, no margin for error. The Finnish team knew all of this. These were not inexperienced thrill seekers. They were trained cave divers, people who understood the risks and had prepared extensively. Their goal was to explore and document the cave. And part of their dive was being filmed for a documentary. Cameras were rolling, capturing the descent into the dark, cold depths of the cave. At the time, no one could have known that the footage would later become a record of a fatal accident. At some point during the dive, 2 of the 6 divers became trapped deep inside the cave. The exact sequence of events has been analyzed and discussed many times, but the outcome was tragically clear. Something went wrong in a part of the cave where turning around or escaping quickly was not possible. Depth, distance, equipment limitations, and the physical structure of the cave worked against them. The remaining divers tried to help, but cave diving emergencies are brutally unforgiving. You can't rush. You can't bring extra air out of nowhere. You can't easily move another diver who is incapacitated, especially in tight passages hundreds of meters underground. Despite their efforts, the two trapped divers died deep within Plura Grotta. When authorities were informed, an assessment was made about the possibility of recovering the bodies. Rescue and recovery missions in caves like Plura Grotta are extremely dangerous, even for highly trained professionals. Every additional diver sent down increases the risk of more deaths. After evaluating the conditions, authorities decided that retrieving the bodies was simply too dangerous. The cave was officially closed to all diving. The divers who had died were to remain where they were. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. A tragic accident followed by a painful but final decision to leave the bodies behind. But in cave diving, this is not unheard of. There are many caves around the world that serve as underwater tombs, places where divers who died were never recovered because the risk was deemed too high. But for the surviving members of the Finnish team, it wasn't over. They had lost their friends in one of the worst ways imaginable. Not only were they dead, but they were also left alone in the dark, cold depths of the cave. The survivors struggled with that reality. The idea that their friends would remain there forever unrecovered was something they could not accept. Despite the official closure of the cave and the ban on diving, the survivors began planning a recovery mission in secret. This alone is chilling to think about. These were people who had already seen firsthand how deadly the cave could be. They knew exactly where their friends had died. They knew the risks better than anyone, and yet they chose to go back. The recovery mission was not impulsive. It required careful planning, specialized equipment, and immense physical and mental preparation. Retrieving bodies from a deep cave is far more complicated than a normal dive. Bodies become entangled, wedged, or difficult to maneuver through narrow passages. Every movement has to be calculated. Every minute increases decompression obligations. Every mistake could result in another death. Still, they went ahead. They returned to Plura Grotta and descended once more into the depths that had already claimed 2 lives. This time the goal was not exploration, not documentation, not discovery. It was to bring their friends home. Against the odds, they succeeded. The surviving divers managed to retrieve the bodies of their friends from deep within the cave. They brought them back up through the same unforgiving passages, fighting exhaustion, cold, stress, and the constant knowledge that one wrong move could kill them too. It is almost impossible to fully grasp the emotional weight of that mission. Diving in silence, in darkness, knowing exactly what had happened there just days before, knowing that the same fate could easily await them. What's remarkable is what happened afterward. Despite the fact that the cave had been officially closed and diving there was forbidden, no charges were pressed against the survivors. Authorities recognized the extraordinary circumstances. They understood the motivation behind the recovery and the risks the divers had taken. The act was seen not as reckless defiance, but as an act driven by loyalty, grief, and respect for the dead. Both the original fatal dive and the recovery mission were filmed for documentary purposes. This adds another layer of unease to the story. Somewhere, there is footage of divers descending into the cave, unaware that 2 of them will never return. There is footage of the recovery, of people going back into a place that nearly killed them, to face the reality of what happened. The incident was widely reported in Finnish media. It struck a nerve with the public, not just because of the deaths, but because of the extreme nature of cave diving itself. Many people who read about it admitted they had never realized just how dangerous this kind of diving was. The combination of depth, isolation, and confined spaces is enough to trigger fear, even in people who are not normally claustrophobic. For me, the thought of it is deeply unsettling. Trying to imagine being 130 meters underground inside a cave system that is not fully mapped, knowing that solid rock surrounds you in every direction, makes my skin crawl. There is no light except what you bring with you, no air except what is strapped to your back, no quick escape. If something goes wrong, help is not minutes away, it is hours away, if it can reach you at all. The tight passages are what get to me the most. Wide open water is one thing. Being forced to squeeze through narrow tunnels, knowing that if you get stuck you might not be able to free yourself, is something else entirely. At depth, panic is deadly. Your breathing rate increases. Your air supply drains faster. Your thinking becomes less clear. Everything depends on staying calm in a situation that feels designed to induce terror. What happened in Plura Grotta is a reminder of how extreme human exploration can be, and how thin the line is between success and disaster. These divers were not careless. They were skilled, trained, and prepared, and still, 2 of them died. The recovery mission adds a complicated emotional layer to the story. On one hand, it was incredibly dangerous and could have resulted in more deaths. On the other, it speaks to the deep bonds formed in such extreme pursuits. The survivors were not willing to abandon their friends, even when told it was too risky. There is something haunting about caves that claim lives. They don't just kill, they keep. They hold on to those who die inside them, sometimes forever. In this case, the cave did not get to keep them, but it came close. Even years later, the story continues to unsettle people, not because of gore or violence, but because of the environment itself. The darkness, the cold, the pressure, the silence, the knowledge that humans willingly enter places where nature has complete control, where mistakes are punished instantly and without mercy. Just thinking about that dive gives me the creeps. The idea of being that deep, that confined in a cave system that is still not fully understood, is terrifying. It's the kind of fear that doesn't rely on imagination. It comes straight from reality. Plura Grotta still stands as a warning, a reminder that some places on this planet are not meant to forgive mistakes, and that sometimes even the most experienced people can be overwhelmed by environments that simply do not care how prepared you think you are. When I look back on the years I worked at that apartment complex, what unsettles me the most isn't a single moment, but how normal everything felt while something deeply wrong was happening right in front of us. It's the kind of story that makes you question your instincts, your memories, and the people you thought you knew. Even now, knowing what I know, I still have trouble reconciling the person I believed he was with what he turned out to be. At the time, the job felt easy and familiar. The apartment complex wasn't fancy, but it was well kept. Tenants came and went, most of them young professionals, couples, and families just starting out. There was a steady rhythm to the place. Work orders came in. Maintenance handled them. Office staff did paperwork, dealt with complaints, smiled, and kept things moving. And it was one of those environments where you see the same faces every day and slowly start to feel like you're part of a small, slightly dysfunctional community. The maintenance man was one of the most liked people there. Everyone knew him. Residents trusted him. Staff trusted him. He had that laid-back, friendly personality that put people at ease immediately. He smiled easily, cracked jokes, and never seemed stressed. He was a stoner, openly so, and somehow that only added to his charm in the eyes of most people. He came across as harmless, almost gentle, the kind of guy you'd never associate with anything dark or threatening. I was actually friends with him, not just co-workers who exchanged pleasantries, but real friends. We'd talk, joke around, and smoke together sometimes. There was nothing about him that set off alarm bells for me. If anything, he seemed like one of the safer people in the building, someone you could relax around. That's what makes what happened so disturbing. One of the small quirks everyone knew about him was his habit of leaving his watch behind in apartments after completing work orders. It happened often enough that it became a kind of running joke. Residents would call the office and say the maintenance guy had left his watch in their bathroom or on their counter again. Someone would laugh, make a comment about how forgetful he was, and then arrange for him to come pick it up. No one thought much of it. People forget things at work all the time. Tools, gloves, phones. A watch didn't seem unusual, and because he was so nice, so trusted, no one questioned his intentions. We all assumed it was an accident, but just another harmless flaw in an otherwise good guy. This went on for years. During that time, he was in and out of countless apartments, bathrooms, bedrooms, private spaces. He saw people at their most vulnerable, though at the time we thought it was just the unavoidable reality of maintenance work. Someone fixing a sink or checking a pipe might briefly see personal things, but there was an unspoken trust that boundaries were respected. That trust was a lie. What no one realized was that the watch he kept forgetting wasn't just a watch. It contained a hidden camera, a spy cam, and he wasn't leaving it behind by accident. He was placing it deliberately, positioning it so it could record. He filmed residents in their bathrooms. He filmed them showering, using the toilet, undressing, standing naked in front of mirrors. Moments that were never meant to be seen by anyone else, let alone recorded. He turned the most private parts of people's lives into something he could watch later, over and over again, without their knowledge or consent. The part that chills me the most is how long it went unnoticed. Years passed without suspicion. No one questioned why the watch kept showing up in the same kinds of places. No one wondered why it was always bathrooms. No one thought to inspect it. Why would they? He was nice. He was friendly. He was someone people trusted. And trust, once given, can blind you. I didn't find out while I was still working there. I left the job for unrelated reasons, moved on with my life, and rarely thought about the apartment complex or the people who worked there. To me, that chapter was closed. Then, about a year after I left, I got a phone call that turned my stomach. It was from a lawyer. At first, I thought it was a mistake. He asked me if I had worked at a particular apartment complex and if I knew a certain maintenance employee by name. When he said the name, my heart dropped. Of course, I knew him. We'd worked together. We'd been friends. The lawyer explained carefully, professionally, that there was an investigation underway. He wanted to know if I had any information that might be relevant, if I had noticed anything unusual, if I had ever heard complaints, if I knew anything about the maintenance man's habits. That was how I learned the truth. As the lawyer spoke, pieces of memory started rearranging themselves in my mind. The jokes about the forgotten watch, the casual way everyone brushed it off, the fact that it always seemed to be left behind in bathrooms. Things that meant nothing at the time suddenly felt sickeningly obvious. I felt nauseous, violated, even though I hadn't been one of the victims. The idea that someone I trusted, someone I spent time with, was secretly recording people like that made my skin crawl. It felt like a betrayal, not just of the residents, but of everyone who had ever believed he was harmless. I answered the lawyer's questions honestly. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much beyond what everyone knew, that he was friendly, that people trusted him, that the watch thing had been common knowledge, but treated as a joke. There was no dramatic revelation on my end, no moment where I suddenly remembered seeing something incriminating. Just the slow, awful realization that sometimes there are no warning signs. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, just staring at nothing. What haunted me most was thinking about the residents, the people who had lived their lives in those apartments, unaware that their privacy had been stolen. People who took showers after long days, who got ready for work in the morning, who had vulnerable moments alone, all while being watched by someone they likely smiled at in the hallway. I wondered how many people were affected, how many recordings existed, how long he had been doing it before anyone caught on, and how many people might never know that their most private moments were violated. It also made me question my own judgment. I had considered him a friend. I had trusted him. I had shared space with him, smoked with him, laughed with him. If he could do something like that and hide it so completely, what did that say about how well we really know anyone? The thing about predators like that is that they don't look like monsters. They don't act like villains from movies. They blend in. They are polite. They are helpful. They are the last people you'd suspect. And that's exactly how they get away with it for so long. What still unsettles me is how easily the situation could have continued if one small thing hadn't gone wrong. If someone hadn't noticed something odd about the watch. If no one had taken a closer look. If trust hadn't finally cracked just enough to let the truth out. I don't know all the details of how he was caught. I don't know exactly what tipped authorities off or how extensive the evidence was. What I do know is that it went on for years without anyone realizing, and that knowledge sits heavy with me. Sometimes I think about how many times I might have defended him if someone had raised a concern while I still worked there. How easily I might have said, "No, he's a good guy," or "He'd never do something like that." That thought scares me almost as much as what he did, because it means that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a smile, shows up to fix your sink, and leaves behind something you assume was forgotten. After I learned the truth, I couldn't stop replaying memories in my head, conversations, jokes, moments where he seemed normal. None of them revealed what he was hiding. There was no crack in the mask that I could point to and say, that was it. That was the warning. And that's the part that sticks with me. Not just that something horrible happened, but that it happened quietly, comfortably, in a place built on routine and trust. That it took advantage of people's kindness and assumptions. That it reminds you how vulnerable you can be without ever realizing it. Even now, years later, I think about that call from the lawyer, how casually it started, how quickly it changed the way I saw an entire period of my life. I think about how many people probably still struggle with what they went through, knowing their privacy was stolen by someone they trusted. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories aren't loud or violent. Sometimes they unfold slowly, unnoticed, hiding behind normalcy and familiarity. Sometimes the person you'd least expect is the one doing the most damage, and sometimes you don't find out until long after you've already walked away, when a phone rings and someone on the other end tells you that the nice guy everyone trusted was never who he seemed to be at all. In North Carolina, there's a restaurant called Yellow Deli, and on the surface, it feels like one of those places you stumble into and immediately want to tell other people about. The building itself looks warm and inviting, almost like it belongs in another era. Old wood, soft lighting, handmade details, the kind of place that feels cozy the moment you walk in. It doesn't feel corporate or rushed. It feels intentional, thoughtful, comfortable. The food is genuinely good, not just fine for a quirky place, but actually good. Fresh bread, hearty sandwiches, soups, simple food done well. The kind of meals that make you slow down without realizing it. The staff are friendly in a way that feels almost excessive at first. They're calm, patient, attentive. They smile a lot. They remember faces. They don't seem stressed, even when the place is busy. If you didn't know anything else, you'd walk out thinking you'd just found a hidden gem. Most people do exactly that. It's only later when someone mentions the place again or you decide to look it up out of curiosity that things start to feel off. Because once you look into it, the atmosphere doesn't feel so harmless anymore. The truth is that everyone who works at the Yellow Deli is part of a religious cult. Not a metaphorical cult the way people sometimes exaggerate about strict churches or intense communities, but an actual organized cult with a long and deeply troubling history. The restaurant isn't just a business. It's a recruitment tool, a front, a way to appear wholesome, welcoming, and harmless to the outside world. The group behind the Yellow Deli traces back to a man named Eugene Gene Spriggs. He was a deeply religious man who believed mainstream Christianity had failed. According to accounts from former members and investigators, his ideas grew more extreme over time. One commonly told origin story is that he became enraged when church services were canceled or disrupted because of something as trivial as the Super Bowl, and he took that as proof that society and organized religion had lost their way. Whether that specific moment was the true catalyst or not, what followed is well documented. Spriggs created a movement that framed itself as a return to true Christian living, community-focused, simple, devout, isolated from the corruption of the modern world. It appealed especially to young people who felt disillusioned, lost, or disconnected, people searching for meaning, people who wanted structure, people who wanted to belong to something that felt pure and purposeful. At first, it didn't look dangerous. People were invited in gently, shared meals, conversations about faith, the promise of a close-knit community that took care of one another, a life free from materialism and chaos. For someone who felt adrift, it could feel like an answer to prayers. But once someone joined, things changed. Leaving was not encouraged. In fact, according to former members, leaving was treated as betrayal. People who tried to leave were reportedly threatened, not just spiritually, but physically. There are accounts of Spriggs and other leaders telling members that if they left, they or their families would be harmed, even if those threats weren't always carried out. By the fear they created was real and effective. Fear is a powerful leash. Inside the group, control extended into every part of daily life. Members were told where to live, how to dress, how to speak, how to think. Personal identity was slowly stripped away and replaced with obedience to the group and its leaders. Outside relationships were discouraged or cut off entirely. Family members who were not part of the group were seen as dangerous influences. Children suffered the most. Former members have described childhoods that sound more like punishment than upbringing. Children were beaten for showing joy. Smiling, laughing, or playing was seen as sinful or rebellious. Any sign of individuality or happiness was treated as something that needed to be corrected. Childhood, as most people understand it, simply didn't exist. And instead of play, children worked. They were forced to work in the kitchens of their communal homes and in the Yellow Deli restaurants themselves. Long hours, hard labor, no pay, no choice. Their work was framed as service to God and the community, but in reality, it was exploitation. The restaurants that felt so wholesome to customers were built and maintained, in part, on the labor of abused children. That's one of the hardest things to sit with when you think about the Yellow Deli. The disconnect between what you see and what's really happening. You sit at a wooden table eating fresh bread made by hand, and the person serving you smiles kindly and asks how everything tastes. You might compliment the food. You might comment on how peaceful the place feels. You might even think, These people seem really happy, but that peace is manufactured. The friendliness isn't freedom, it's expectation. The calm isn't comfort, it's conditioning. Many of the people working there have never known a life outside the group. They don't have the option to quit, to walk away, to decide they want something different. The smile isn't proof of happiness, it's proof of control. What makes the Yellow Deli especially unsettling is that, compared to some cults, it doesn't look extreme at first glance. There are no obvious warning signs, no locked doors, no visible guards, no overt violence happening in front of customers. That's what allows it to continue operating so openly. People assume that something truly dangerous would be easier to spot. But cults don't survive by being obvious. They survive by being subtle, by blending in, by wrapping themselves in comfort, routine, and familiarity. A restaurant is the perfect disguise. Food disarms people. Hospitality lowers defenses. Warm lighting and kind voices make it easier to believe that nothing bad could be happening behind the scenes. And yet, former members continue to speak out. They talk about beatings, about fear, about children growing up believing pain was normal and joy was sinful, about adults who stayed not because they wanted to, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they tried to leave, about lives spent working endlessly for a group that took everything and gave back obedience in return. What's chilling is how many people still don't know. The Yellow Deli continues to attract customers who have no idea who they're supporting. People stop in for lunch. They bring friends. They recommend it online. They leave glowing reviews about the atmosphere and the staff. And unless someone tells them or they decide to dig deeper, they never see the darker truth underneath. That's what makes this story stick with me. Not that the cult exists. Cults have existed forever. Not that people are manipulated. That happens all the time. What's disturbing is how close it hides to normal life. How easy it is to walk into it, enjoy it, and walk back out without realizing what you just participated in. It forces you to question how many other things like this exist in plain sight. How many places feel safe and wholesome because they're designed to feel that way. How often comfort is used as camouflage. The Yellow Deli isn't the most violent cult story you'll ever hear. There are no mass deaths tied to it. No single explosive event that forces it into the public consciousness. And maybe that's why it continues, because it exists in that uncomfortable gray area where the harm is ongoing, quiet, and easy to ignore. But the harm is real. Children beaten for smiling. Families controlled through fear. Lives shaped by obedience instead of choice. All hidden behind good food and friendly service. Once you know that, it's impossible to sit in a place like that and feel at ease again. And that's the part that lingers. The idea that sometimes the scariest places aren't abandoned buildings or dark woods or locked doors. Sometimes they're warm, welcoming, and full of people smiling at you, hoping you never ask the wrong questions. In the spring of 1846, a group of families and individuals gathered in Missouri with the same dream that pulled so many people west during that time. They wanted a better life. California, they believed, offered fertile land, opportunity, and a future that felt impossible where they were. Like thousands of others, they planned to travel along the Oregon Trail, a route that was dangerous but well known. People had made the journey before. There were guidebooks, stories, and at least some sense of what to expect. This group would later become known as the Donner Party. At the beginning, there was nothing especially unusual about them. They were farmers, parents, children, newly married couples, and older pioneers who had already lived hard lives. They traveled in wagons pulled by oxen, carrying food, tools, clothing, and the few personal items they could not leave behind. Spirits were high when they set out. Spring was the right time to travel, and they believed that if they kept a steady pace, they would reach California before winter. Originally, they were part of a larger wagon train. Traveling in numbers offered safety, shared labor, and reassurance. But along the way, the group faced a choice that would seal their fate. A man named Lansford Hastings had been promoting a supposed shortcut to California, later known as the Hastings Cutoff. He claimed it would save time and distance, allowing travelers to reach their destination faster than those who stayed on the traditional trail. Several families, including the Donners and the Reeds, decided to take this new route. They believed Hastings' promises. What they did not know was that Hastings himself had never guided wagons through the cutoff. His descriptions were misleading and in some cases outright false. The route had not been tested by wagon trains, and the terrain was far more difficult than anyone expected. When the group split off from the main trail, they left behind not just other travelers, but safety, experience, and time. Almost immediately, problems began to appear. The Hastings Cutoff led them into rough, unmapped land. There were no clear paths. Trees had to be chopped down so wagons could pass. Thick brush had to be cleared by hand. Progress slowed to a crawl. Days turned into weeks as they struggled through the Salt Lake Valley and surrounding terrain. The effort exhausted both people and animals. Oxen weakened under the strain. Tempers flared. Supplies were used up far faster than planned. Every delay pushed them closer to winter, though many still believed they could make it through the mountains before the snow fell. They were wrong. By November, the group reached the Sierra Nevada mountains. Under normal conditions, the pass might still have been possible, but that year winter came early and with brutal force. Heavy snowstorms hit the mountains, dumping feet of snow in a short period of time. The wagons became stuck. Paths disappeared under white drifts. The pioneers found themselves trapped, unable to move forward or backward. They built makeshift camps near what is now Donner Lake, using their wagons and whatever materials they could find. Shelters were crude and offered little protection from the cold. Snow piled higher and higher, cutting them off completely from the outside world. With each storm, hope faded. Food quickly became the most pressing concern. The supplies they had brought were never meant to last through an entire winter. As days passed, rations were reduced. Hunger became constant. Children cried at night. Adults grew weaker and quieter. Eventually, they made the decision to kill their oxen for meat. These animals had been essential to their journey, pulling wagons and carrying loads. Now they became the only thing standing between the group and starvation. The meat provided some relief, but it did not last long. Once the oxen were gone, desperation set in. People began boiling leather from shoes, belts, and wagon covers, trying to extract any nutrients they could. They chewed on bones, hoping for some trace of sustenance. Some even ate cloth from their handcarts. Hunger twisted their thinking and stripped away any sense of normalcy. As conditions worsened, deaths began to occur. Illness, malnutrition, and exposure claimed the weakest first, especially the elderly and young children. Each death brought grief, but also an unspoken realization. The dead represented food. Cannibalism was not an immediate choice. It was something people resisted, something that went against everything they believed. But hunger does not care about morality. Slowly, painfully, people began to cross that line. To preserve some sense of humanity, bodies were labeled with names, so no one would eat a close family member. It was a small, fragile rule in a situation where all rules had collapsed. By this point, word of the trapped pioneers had reached California, and rescue attempts were organized. The journey back through the mountains was dangerous, even for well-prepared travelers. Still, people volunteered. The first rescue party managed to reach the camp and take a group of survivors, many of them children. These rescuers knew they could not take everyone at once. The snow, the terrain, and their limited supplies made it impossible. Leaving people behind was agonizing, but there was no other choice. One woman could not bear the thought of being separated from her young daughter. She chose to accompany the group, despite the danger. The journey back was brutal. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion followed them every step of the way. Tragically, the woman's daughter, only 3 years old, died during the trip. The decision to leave the camp had been made in hope, but it ended in heartbreak. A second rescue party followed, but by the time they arrived, conditions were even worse. Many of the people they hoped to save were already dead. Only 3 were able to leave with them. The rest were too weak, too ill, or already gone. When the third rescue party finally reached the camp, what they found was almost beyond comprehension. They discovered a single man still alive. He was surrounded by human bones. Nearby was a bucket filled with human blood. The man was alive, but barely. He could not stop shivering from hypothermia. His body and mind were pushed far past their limits. In the end, only 48 of the original 87 people survived. More than half of those survivors had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. The experience haunted them for the rest of their lives. Some tried to explain what they had endured. Others never spoke of it again. The Donner Party became a symbol of both human endurance and human desperation. Their story is not just about poor decisions or bad luck, though both played a role. It is about how thin the line is between civilization and survival, how quickly rules, beliefs, and identities can fall away when faced with starvation and death. They set out with hope, believing they were choosing a faster, better path. Instead, they found themselves trapped by snow, hunger, and fear. The mountains did not care about their dreams or intentions. Winter came all the same. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story of the Donner Party remains unsettling. It forces us to imagine what we would do in their place, how far we would go to survive, and whether, when pushed to the edge, we would recognize ourselves in the choices they were forced to make. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.